Before European explorers arrived, North America was home to many diverse Native American societies. These groups adapted to their environments and developed unique cultures, economies, and political systems. In the Southwest, groups such as the Pueblos and Navajo lived in the arid desert of present-day New Mexico and Arizona. They relied on farming maize and building complex irrigation systems, along with multi-story cliff dwellings and adobe villages. Across the Great Plains, native peoples lived a more mobile lifestyle. Because of the dry grasslands, they survived on hunting bison and living in portable teepees. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy and Algonquin peoples combined hunting, gathering, and agriculture. The Iroquois created powerful political alliances that helped maintain peace and protect their territory. Meanwhile, along the Pacific Northwest coast, natives built permanent villages and sustained large populations through fishing, hunting sea mammals, and participating in extensive trade networks. Although these societies were very different from one another, they all adapted successfully to their environment. At the same time, Europe was connected to Asia through the Silk Roads, a trade network stretching roughly 4,000 miles across Eurasia. These routes allowed Europeans to obtain valuable goods from Asia, but the Ottoman Empire imposed heavy taxes on merchants traveling along them. As a result, European nations began searching for alternative routes to Asia. This desire to bypass the Silk Roads would eventually lead to exploration across the Atlantic and permanently changing world history. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west in search of a new route to Asia. Instead, he reached the Americas and unintentionally connected Europe, Africa, and the New World. This was significant because it marked the beginning of sustained contact between two hemispheres that had largely been separated for thousands of years. News of these lands spread quickly throughout Europe. Soon, other explorers and settlers arrived seeking what historians often call the three Gs: gold, God, and glory. They hoped to gain wealth, spread Christianity, and expand their nation's power. This age of exploration was made possible by technological innovations such as the caravel, compass, and astrolabe, which allowed sailors to travel farther and navigate more accurately than ever before. As more Europeans arrived, their contact with native peoples led to one of the most important exchanges. That was known as the Columbian Exchange. European exploration triggered the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of goods, people, animals, and diseases between the eastern and western hemispheres. From the Americas, crops such as maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and tobacco spread to Europe, Africa, and Asia. These crops increased food supplies and contributed a significant population growth throughout the Old World. From Europe, Africa, and Asia came horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, rice, sugar, coffee, and bananas. Horses especially transformed life for many native groups by increasing mobility and hunting efficiency. However, the most devastating part of the Columbian Exchange was disease. Smallpox, measles, and malaria spread rapidly among Native American populations who had little or no immunity. Historians estimate that disease killed up to 90% of Native Americans in some areas. This was significant because it dramatically weakened Native societies and made it easier for European powers to establish control over large areas of the Americas. As Spain expanded its influence, it looked for ways to exploit the resources and labor of the New World. Spain established the encomienda system to extract wealth from its growing empire. Under this system, Spanish colonists received land and the right to force Native Americans to work in mines and plantations. In return, they were expected to provide protection and convert Native peoples to Christianity. Although Spanish officials claimed the system benefited both sides, it often resulted in severe exploitation and harsh working conditions. The system was significant because it allowed Spain to extract enormous amounts of gold and silver from the Americas, helping Spain become one of the most powerful nations in Europe. However, disease and forced labor caused Native populations to decline even further. As a result, Spain faced a growing labor shortage and began searching for another source of workers. To solve this labor shortage, Spain increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. Through the Asiento system, merchants were contracted to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to work in mines and plantations throughout the Americas. This expansion of the transatlantic slave trade permanently reshaped the New World. It was significant because African labor became a major foundation of colonial economies, while African, European, and native cultures blended together to create entirely new societies throughout the Americas. At the same time, Spain's wealth and success encouraged other European nations to seek their own colonies in the New World. As Spain grew wealthy from its American empire, England became determined to compete for land, resources, and influence. England's first major attempt at colonization was the Roanoke colony. Unlike Spanish settlements, Roanoke was not heavily funded by the English government and instead relied largely on private investment. England also hoped colonies would provide bases for attacking Spanish treasure ships carrying wealth from the Americas. However, Roanoke suffered from poor planning, inadequate supplies, and strained relations with Native Americans. Eventually, the colony disappeared, becoming known as a lost colony. Although Roanoke failed, it demonstrated England's growing commitment to colonization and its willingness to challenge Spanish dominance in the Americas. England's ability to challenge Spain increased dramatically in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Spain assembled a massive fleet of approximately 130 ships and 30,000 men with the goal of invading England and restoring Catholic influence. The English Navy possessed smaller, faster, more maneuverable ships that relied heavily on long-range artillery. When the Spanish anchored near France to meet with an invasion force, the English launched fire ships into the harbor at night. Panic spread throughout the fleet, causing the Spanish formation to break apart. The English attacked the ships, forcing the Armada to retreat. As it sailed home, the powerful storms destroyed many additional vessels. The defeat of the Armada was significant because it weakened Spanish naval dominance and allowed England to emerge as major maritime powers. As a result, England could focus more on resources, colonization, paving the way for future settlements in North America. In 1607, England established Jamestown, the first successful permanent English settlement in North America. Unlike Roanoke, Jamestown was funded by the Virginia Company, a joint stock company that spread financial risk among investors. This system was significant because it provided the funding and organization necessary for colonization to succeed where previous efforts had failed. The colony struggled during its early years. Settlers faced disease, starvation, poor relations with natives, and lack of clean drinking water. The economic turning point came when settlers began cultivating tobacco, which quickly became a profitable cash crop. Tobacco transformed Jamestown into a successful colony and encouraged further English settlements throughout North America. Jamestown was also politically significant because it hosted the first meeting of the House of Burgesses in 1619, the first representative legislative assembly in North America. This introduced traditions of self-government that would become a defining feature of English colonies. By the end of Period 1, the Americas had been transformed by European contact. What began as a continent populated by diverse Native American societies became increasingly shaped by European colonization, Atlantic trade, and cultural exchange. The Columbian Exchange reshaped populations and economies across the globe. Spanish colonization and the transatlantic slave trade altered the demographics of the New World. England's defeat of the Spanish Armada opened the door for greater English expansion, while the success of Jamestown provided that permanent English settlement in North America was possible. Most importantly, Jamestown's success encouraged the establishment of additional English colonies. These colonies would grow into distinct regions with unique economies, cultures, and political traditions. As more settlers arrived, colonial societies expanded. The foundation of the 13 colonies were established, setting the stage for the development of colonial America during Period 2. Period 2 begins with the success of Jamestown. After years of struggle, the colony finally became profitable through the cultivation of tobacco. This success was significant because it demonstrated that English colonies in North America could survive and generate wealth. As a result, England became increasingly interested in colonization. New settlements were established along the Atlantic coast, eventually forming what became known as the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. As more settlers arrived, the colonies developed unique economies, cultures, and political systems. Although they remained under British rule, colonists gradually became more independent and accustomed to governing themselves. These developments laid the foundation for future tensions between Britain and its colonies. As English settlements expanded, three distinct colonial regions emerged. The New England colonies included Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Many settlers were Puritans seeking religious freedom. Because the region had rocky soil and short growing seasons, large plantations were difficult to establish. Instead, New England developed economies based on fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and small-scale farming. This was significant because slavery never became as central to New England economy as it did in the South. These regional differences later contribute to political disagreements and sectional conflict in American history. The Middle colonies included New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. These colonies became known for their religious diversity and fertile farmland. Their productive agriculture earned them the nickname the Bread Colonies, while major cities became important centers of trade and commerce. Further south, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia developed plantation economies based on tobacco, rice, and indigo. Because these labor-intensive cash crops required large workforces, slavery became increasingly important to Southern economy. Although each region developed differently, geography heavily influenced how people lived and worked. Over time, colonists shared experiences that helped create a common colonial identity. As colonies grew larger and more wealthy, colonists also began creating institutions that allowed them to govern themselves. One of the earliest examples of self-government was the House of Burgesses, established in Virginia in 1619. The House of Burgesses became the first democratically elected legislative body in British North America. It consisted of elected representatives who could create local laws, manage taxes, and address the concerns of colonists. Although the governor and the British royal crown retained veto power, the House of Burgesses gave colonists practical experience in representative government. At roughly the same time, another important example of self-government emerged in New England. In 1620, the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact. This document created a self-governing political community based on majority rule and cooperation. The Mayflower Compact was significant because it established the principle that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. This idea would later influence the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Together, the House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact helped establish traditions of representative government and self-rule. As colonist settlements expanded, however, they increasingly became in conflict with Native Americans. As more colonists arrived, they demanded more land. This expansion often came at the expense of Native American communities. One of the most significant conflicts was King Philip's War in New England. This war was led by Metacom, who the English called King Philip. Native groups fought against colonial expansion, unfair land agreements, and increasing English control over their lives. The conflict became one of the bloodiest wars in American history relative to population. Although native forces initially achieved success, the colonists eventually won. many Native Americans were killed, displaced, or sold into slavery. This victory was significant because it greatly weakened Native resistance in southern New England and opened more land for colonial settlement. At the same time, Native resistance also emerged in the Southwest. In 1680, the Pueblo Revolt unified numerous Pueblo communities under the leadership of Pope. The revolt was fueled by Spanish religious persecution, forced labor, and harsh treatments of Native people. Unlike many Native uprisings, the Pueblo Revolt succeeded. The Pueblo people drove the Spanish out of the region for 12 years. This made it the most successful Native American revolt against European colonizers in North American history. When the Spanish eventually returned, they adopted a more flexible approach, allowing many traditional Pueblo practices to continue. These conflicts demonstrated that Native Americans continued resisting European expansion, but they also showed that colonial settlements were becoming increasingly dominant. As colonial society expanded, another major issue emerged: labor. The growth of plantation agriculture created an enormous demand for labor. Early colonies heavily relied on indentured servants, many of who came from Europe seeking economic opportunity. However, tensions between wealthy landowners and poor settlers eventually erupted into violence. In 1676, Nathan Bacon led Bacon's Rebellion against Virginia Governor William Berkeley. Many poor farmers felt ignored by colonial leaders and were frustrated by the government's inability to protect frontier settlements from Native American attacks. The rebellion ultimately resulted in the burning of Jamestown. Although Bacon died and the rebellion collapsed, it had lasting consequences. Colonial elites became alarmed because poor white settlers and black laborers had united against the government. To prevent future uprisings, wealthy planters increasingly moved away from indentured servitude and expanded racial slavery. This transition built upon developments that had already begun in 1619 when the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. Although their legal status was initially unclear, this event marked the beginning of African slavery in England's mainland colonies. As plantation agriculture expanded, millions of Africans were transported across the Atlantic through the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was a brutal middle leg of the triangular trade. Conditions aboard the slave ships were horrific. Captives endured overcrowding, disease, abuse, and extreme high mortality rates. Despite these hardships, enslaved Africans resisted slavery in many ways. One of the most significant examples was the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in southern Carolina. Enslaved people seized weapons, marched south towards Spanish Florida, and attempted to secure their freedom. Although the rebellion was eventually crushed, it terrified slave owners and led to the passage of stricter slave codes. By the 18th century, slaves had become a defining feature of colonial society, especially in the southern colonies. While slavery expanded, Britain also attempted to strengthen control over colonial trade. During this period, Britain followed the economic philosophy of mercantilism. Under mercantilism, colonies existed primarily to benefit the mother country. To enforce this system, Parliament passed the Navigations Act. These laws required colonies to trade primarily with Britain and restricted commerce with foreign nations. While the Navigation Acts helped stimulate colonial shipbuilding, they also limited the profits of colonial merchants and farmers. As a result, many colonists became frustrated with British economic restrictions. Although these disagreements did not immediately lead to revolution, they did plant the seed of future conflict. At the same time, colonists were being influenced by new intellectual and religious movements that encouraged them to question authority. One of the most important intellectual movements of the 18th century was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment emphasized reason, science, individual rights, and skepticism towards traditional authority. Thinkers such as John Locke argued that people possess natural rights and the government derived power from consent of the governed. These ideas would later become central to American political thought. At the same time, colonies experienced the First Great Awakening. This religious revival swept through the colonies during the 1730s and the 1740s. Preachers such as John Edwards and George Whitefield encouraged colonists to develop personal relationships with God rather than relying entirely on established churches. This movement was significant because it encouraged people to question traditional authority and think independently. As colonists learned to challenge religious authority, they also became more willing to challenge political authority. This growing independence was reflected in the Zenger trial of 1735. John Peter Zenger was arrested for criticizing New York's royal governor. His defense argued that truth should not be considered libel. The jury ultimately acquitted Zenger, establishing an important precedent for freedom of the press and demonstrating that the colonists were increasingly willing to challenge government authority. These developments helped create a colonial society that valued liberty, individual rights, and self-government. The ultimate turning point, however, came with the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War began because Britain and France both sought control of the Ohio River Valley and the lucrative fur trade. In 1754, a young George Washington's actions in the region helped ignite the conflict. During the early years of the war, France and its allies and its native allies achieved several important victories. However, Britain eventually committed massive resources and troops to North America. A major turning point came in 1759 when British forces captured Quebec. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. France lost Canada and nearly all of its territories east of the Mississippi, dramatically expanding British control in North America. Although Britain emerged victorious, the war created serious problems. Conflict left Britain deeply in debt. Native American groups were angered by the exclusion from the peace negotiations and resisted British expansion. In response, British issued the Proclamation of 1763, restricting colonial settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. To pay off war debts, Britain also began imposing new taxes on the colonies. These actions angered many colonists and fundamentally changed the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. For the first time, many colonists began to question whether British rule was truly protecting their rights and interests. By the end of Period 2, the colonies had transformed from small settlements into thriving and diverse societies. Colonists developed representative governments, expanded trade networks, and created regional economies and established traditions of self-rule. At the same time, conflicts with Native Americans, the expansion of slavery, Enlightenment ideas, and the Great Awakening shaped colonial identity. Most importantly, the French and Indian War marked a major turning point. Although Britain won the war, the cost of victory led British government to tighten control of the colonies through new taxes and regulations. For generations, colonists had become accustomed to governing themselves, and many believed their rights and freedoms were being threatened. As tensions between Britain and colonies continued to grow, the stage was set for the American Revolution and the beginning of Period 3. During Period 3, 13 British colonies evolved from loyal subjects of the British Empire into an independent nation with its own government and constitution. At the end of Period 2, Britain emerged victorious from the French and Indian War. However, the war left Britain deeply in debt. To pay these costs and maintain control of its growing empire, Britain began placing new taxes and restrictions on the colonies. For decades, colonists had become accustomed to self-government through institutions such as the House of Burgesses and colonial assemblies. As Britain attempted to exert greater control, many colonists believed their rights as English citizens were being violated. The conflict that followed would lead to protests, boycotts, political organization, and eventually revolution. Yet winning independence was only the beginning. Americans would then face the challenge of creating a government capable of preserving liberty and maintaining order. Period 3, therefore, tells the story of how the United States fought for independence, established a new government, and survived the challenge of becoming a nation. Following the French and Indian War, Britain sought to maintain tighter control over its colonies. Britain then attempted to raise revenue through new taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765 placed taxes on newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and other printed materials. Colonists responded with protests and boycotts, arguing that Parliament had no right to tax them without representation. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a cry throughout the colonies. Although the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament continued asserting its authority through Townshend Acts. These taxes increased colonial resentment and eventually contributed to violence. In 1770, tensions erupted during the Boston Massacre when British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5 people. Patriot leaders used the event as propaganda, portraying Britain as an oppressive government. Relations worsened further when Parliament passed the Tea Act. In response, members of the Sons of Liberty organized the Boston Tea Party in 1773 and dumped British tea into the Boston Harbor. Britain responded with the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor and placing Massachusetts under greater British control. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these laws united many colonists against Britain. As a result, delegates gathered at the First Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate colonial resistance. For the first time, the colonies were acting together as Americans rather than separate British colonies. Despite efforts to avoid war, fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. British troops attempted to seize colonial weapons and arrest Patriot leaders. Colonial military confronted them, and the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. Once the war began, the Second Continental Congress met and appointed George Washington commander of the Continental Army. Although many colonists initially hoped for reconciliation, support for independence rapidly increased after the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Paine argued that independence was both logical and necessary, convincing many ordinary colonists to support separation from Britain. These ideas helped pave the way for the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration drew heavily from Enlightenment ideas and John Locke's theory of natural rights. It declared that all people possess rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. This transformed the conflict from a rebellion into a fight for national independence. The war itself was difficult for the Americans. One of the darkest moments came during the winter at Valley Forge, where Washington's soldiers suffered from cold, hunger, disease, and lack of supplies. Despite these hardships, the Continental Army survived and emerged stronger. A major turning point came at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. The American victory convinced France that the colonies had a realistic chance of winning. As a result, France entered the war as an ally of the United States. French money, troops, weapons, and naval support became critical to the American war effort. The final major battle occurred at Yorktown in 1781. American and French forces trapped British General Cornwallis forced to surrender. Although fighting continued briefly, Yorktown effectively ended the revolution. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized American independence and granted the United States territory stretching to the Mississippi. America won its freedom. However, independence created a new challenge. How should the nation govern itself? America's first government operated under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles intentionally created a weak national government because Americans feared centralized authority after their experiences with Britain. Congress lacked the power to tax citizens, regulate trade, or effectively enforce laws. Despite these weaknesses, the Articles government did achieve some successes. One important accomplishment was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance established a process for admitting new states to the Union and prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. This was significant because it created an orderly system for westward expansion and demonstrated the United States intended to continue growing. However, weaknesses in the Articles became increasingly obvious. These problems reached a breaking point during Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Massachusetts farmers, burdened by debt and high taxes, launched an armed uprising against state authorities. The national government struggled to respond because it lacked sufficient power. Many leaders feared that the nation could descend into chaos if changes were not made. As a result, delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787. The Constitutional Convention was originally called to revise the Articles of Confederation, but instead, delegates decided to create an entirely new system of government. The Constitution established a stronger federal government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It also created a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. The Constitution sparked a major debate. Federalists supported ratification because they believed a stronger national government was necessary. Anti-Federalists feared that the government might become too powerful and threaten individual rights. To gain support, Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. The Bill of Rights was added in 1791. These first 10 amendments protected freedoms such as speech, religion, press, assembly, and due process. Together, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights established the foundation of American government that still exists today. The new government faced many challenges during its early years. As the first president of the United States, George Washington established important precedents that future presidents would follow. He created the presidential cabinet and helped strengthen confidence in the new government. One of the most influential members of Washington's administration was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton proposed a financial plan that would include paying off national debt, assuming state debt, and creating a national bank. This plan strengthened the federal government and improved the nation's economy. However, it also sparked political disagreements. These disagreements contributed to the emergence of America's first political parties. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, favored strong federal government. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, favored limited federal power and stronger state governments. The strength of the new governments was tested during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Unlike the governments under the Articles of Confederation, Washington successfully used federal troops to restore order. This demonstrated that the Constitution had created a much stronger national government. By the end of Period 3, the American colonies had transformed to an independent nation. What began as a resistance to British taxes and regulations grew into a revolution that created the United States. Americans defeated the British Empire, establishing a new government, wrote the Constitution, and successfully navigated the challenges of becoming a nation. The election of 1800 provided the final test of the new system. When Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams, political power transferred peacefully between rival parties. This demonstrated that the Constitution worked and that disagreements could be resolved through elections rather than violence. As Period 4 begins, the United States will focus less on achieving independence and more on defining its future. The nation will expand westward through events such as the Louisiana Purchase, develop a stronger national economy, experience growing sectional differences, and increasingly debate the issue of slavery. The foundations created during Period 3 made this expansion possible and prepared the United States for the next stage of growth.
How did APUSH Period 3 lead into Period 4? Well, in order to understand Period 4, we need to understand what America looked like after the American Revolution in 1775 to 1783. The United States had won its independence, created the Constitution, and established a new government, but now it faced a new challenge, proving that the country could survive economically and politically without relying on a foreign nation like Europe. One of the biggest developments was the beginning of the market revolution in the 1790s. The market revolution transformed the United States from a collection of local economies into a connected national economy. This movement would become especially important after the War of 1812, because Americans realized they needed to become more economically self-sufficient instead of depending on foreign nations. At the same time, technological innovations were transforming different regions of the country. In the South, Eli Whitney's cotton gin made cotton production much faster and more profitable. Hence, cotton became known as King Cotton. And slavery expanded dramatically since plantation owners needed more enslaved laborers to grow and harvest the ever-valuable cotton. This tied the Southern economy directly to slavery. Meanwhile, in the North, Samuel Slater introduced British textile manufacturing techniques and established one of America's first cotton mills. His work helped launch industrialization in the North and created the American textile industry. While the South became increasingly agricultural and dependent on slavery, the North became increasingly industrialized. These differences would create growing sectional tension throughout the 19th century. Politically, the new government was still defining its powers. The Judiciary Act of 1789 attempted to establish the federal court system and define the Supreme Court's authority. However, the true power of the judiciary would not be established until the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison, which takes place in Period 4. These economic, political, and regional developments laid the foundation for Period 4. The first major event of Period 4 was the election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams and became president. The significance of this election goes far beyond who won. For the first time in modern history, political power peacefully transferred from one political party to another. Despite bitter campaigning between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, the Constitution worked, and power changed hands without violence. Jefferson immediately reduced military spending and shrank parts of the federal government. This began a long period of Democratic-Republican dominance in American politics. However, before leaving office, the Federalists attempted to maintain influence by appointing several Federalist judges. These became known as the Midnight Judges. Jefferson refused to recognize some of these appointments. One of the appointees, William Marbury, sued. This led directly to Marbury v. Madison in 1803. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. More importantly, he established the principle of judicial review, which gave the Supreme Court the power to declare laws unconstitutional. This was a turning point because it made the Supreme Court an equal branch of government capable of checking Congress and the President. Jefferson then made another major decision, the Louisiana Purchase. By purchasing Louisiana from France, Jefferson doubled the size of the United States. This encouraged Western settlements to place Native Americans and strengthened the idea of manifest destiny. However, it also raised a question that had dominated American politics for decades. Would slavery expand into new territories? That issue would eventually lead to compromises, sectional conflict, and ultimately the Civil War, on top of native conflicts from their displacement. As the nation continued to expand, relations with Britain deteriorated. Britain was impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy, restricting American trade through blockades, and supplying Native Americans with weapons to resist American expansion. These actions led to the War of 1812. Many historians call it the Second American Revolution because it confirmed the United States could survive independently from Britain. The war had several important consequences. First, Native American resistance in the Northwest largely collapsed after the defeat of Tecumseh's Confederacy. Second, the war encouraged economic self-sufficiency and accelerated the market revolution because Americans realized they could not depend on foreign manufacturing. Third, the war launched Andrew Jackson into national fame after his victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Finally, the war produced a wave of nationalism and patriotism throughout the country. This nationalism would lead directly into the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings emerged after the War of 1812. One reason was the collapse of the Federalist Party. The Federalists had openly opposed the War of 1812 and damaged their reputation through the Hartford Convention, where they displayed those ideas. Many Americans viewed them as unpatriotic. As a result, the Democratic Republicans became the dominant political party, creating what appeared to be a one-party system. This period became known as the era of good feelings because many Americans believed political divisions had altogether disappeared. However, underneath this apparent unity, sectional tensions were growing. This was especially exemplified by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, while Maine entered as a free state. Congress also established the 36th parallel, declaring slavery illegal north of that boundary within the Louisiana Territory. The compromise temporarily resolved the issue, but it also revealed how divided the North and South had become. Later, this compromise would even be overturned by the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Period 5, which I'll tell you more about later. Similarly, the Panic of 1819 became the first major economic depression in American history and broke the facade of the era of good feelings. The panic damaged confidence in the national economy and weakened trust in the national bank. The illusion of national unity was beginning to crack as Americans began to lose confidence in their government. In order to assert that America was truly unified and able to function on its own, President Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine warned European powers not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. Although America lacked the military power to fully enforce it, the doctrine demonstrated growing American confidence and showed that the United States was beginning to view itself as a major power. The era of good feelings would officially end during the election of 1824. No candidate won through electoral votes, so the election was decided by the House of Representatives. One of the candidates who was out of the race and was also a member of the House was known as Henry Clay. He supported John Quincy Adams, thus helping Adams win and ending the so-called one-party system. Afterwards, Adams appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters immediately accused the two men of making a secret deal, calling it the corrupt bargain. Public outrage fueled support for Andrew Jackson and would lead directly to his victory in the next election of 1828. He came to represent the rise of the common man and dramatically expanded presidential power. He used the veto more frequently than any president previously and challenged the idea that Congress was superior to the president. However, his presidency was also highly controversial. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. This law forced Native Americans to move west of the Mississippi River. The most famous example was the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee died while being forced to relocate. Jackson also fought the Second Bank of the United States. Believing the bank favored wealthy elites, he vetoed its recharter and effectively destroyed it. This decision weakened the economy and contributed to the Panic of 1837. Jackson also faced the nullification crisis. Congress passed tariffs that hurt the Southern economy. South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, declared the tariffs null and void and threatened to secede from the Union. Jackson responded by threatening military force. Although the crisis was resolved through the Compromise Tariff of 1833, it established a dangerous precedent because it raised the question of whether states could ignore the federal law or leave the Union. This issue would return during the Civil War.
Jackson's string of controversy would continue with the Panic of 1837, resulting largely from Jackson's destruction of the national bank and its Specie Circular, which required land purchases to be made using gold or silver. Banks began failing, unemployment increased, the economy collapsed. This economic crisis helped the Whig Party gain political power. The Whigs won the election of 1840 with William Henry Harrison. However, Harrison died shortly after taking office, and Vice President John Tyler became president. Tyler accomplished very little, and divisions within the Whig Party continued to grow. While political tensions were increasing, a religious rival known as the Second Great Awakening transformed American society. Leaders such as Charles Finney emphasized free will instead of predestination. This revival encouraged Americans to believe they could improve both themselves and society. As a result, reform movements expanded. The Second Great Awakening inspired the temperance movement, abolitionism, and eventually the women's rights movement. These reform movements become major forces during Period 5. As Period 4 ended, sectional tensions continued to grow. The Second Great Awakening inspired reformers. The Whig Party increasingly opposed slavery. Eventually, the Whig Party collapsed, and many former Whigs joined the newly created Republican Party. At the same time, abolitionism inspired women to demand rights for themselves, eventually leading to Seneca Falls and the women's suffrage movement. America was becoming increasingly divided over slavery, expansion, and political power. These tensions directly launched Period 5. To start Period 5, James K. Polk would win the election of 1844. Polk strongly supported the Manifesto, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across North America. One of his first major actions was annexing Texas despite Mexican warnings that doing so could lead to war. Upon annexing Texas, Mexico would break diplomatic relations with the United States. The stage was set for war. The Mexican-American War began because of border disputes between Texas and Mexico. After a skirmish occurred, Polk claimed that American blood had been shed on American soil and requested a declaration of war from Congress. The United States would win the war decisively. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, gave America over 500,000 square miles of territory, including California and New Mexico. Mexico received roughly $15 million in promised citizenship rights to Mexicans living in seceded territory. The Gadsden Purchase of 1853 would later complete the continental borders of the United States. Soon after, the California Gold Rush attracted thousands of settlers westwards. However, expansion reignited the slavery debate. The Wilmot Proviso would attempt to ban slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico. Although it would eventually fail, it intensified sectional conflict. Just 13 years later, those same tensions would help cause the Civil War. In order to address these growing sectional tensions, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. California entered as a free state. In return, the Fugitive Slave Act required escaped slaves to be returned to their owners regardless of their location. The law was especially controversial because accused fugitives were denied jury trials, and commissioners were paid more money for returning people to slavery than for declaring them free. Northern outrage increased dramatically. Soon afterward, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and introduced popular sovereignty. Settlers flooded into Kansas and Nebraska, hoping to determine whether slavery would be legal. Violence erupted. This conflict would become known as Bleeding Kansas. One of the most famous figures from this time was John Brown, who later led a raid on Harper's Ferry and killed several pro-slavery supporters. Although Brown was captured and executed, he used his trial to promote abolition. As industrialization expanded, some Americans rejected growing materialism. This led to the rise of transcendentalism. Thinkers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau emphasized self-reliance, individualism, nature, and emotion. Thoreau's concept of civil disobedience encouraged people to resist unjust laws. His ideas later influenced abolitionists and eventually Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement.
Transcendentalism helped strengthen unique American culture and inspired reform movements focused on equality. The Second Great Awakening and Transcendentalism would directly inspire women who had already played a large role in abolition, and as they fought against slavery, many began asking why they themselves lacked political rights. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention. Participants produced the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. This document listed grievances against men and demanded equal rights for women. The convention launched the women's suffrage movement. At the same time, abolitionism expanded rapidly. Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin exposed the horrors of slavery and increased Northern opposition. The Underground Railroad became increasingly active. Harriet Tubman risked her life repeatedly to guide enslaved people to freedom. Frederick Douglass similarly became one of the nation's most influential abolitionist speakers, also helping slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. These developments angered Southern slave owners and further increased sectional tensions. One of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history was Dred Scott v. Sanford. The court ruled that African Americans were not citizens. It also ruled that Congress could not ban slavery in federal territories. This effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise. The court also undermined popular sovereignty by making it difficult to prohibit slavery in the Western territories. Southerners celebrated the decision. Northerners, on the other hand, were outraged, increasingly believed in a slave power conspiracy across America. The decision became one of the final steps towards starting a civil war. The election of 1860 would be a four-way race. Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, Constitutional Unionists, and Republicans all competed. Abraham Lincoln would win the election despite receiving almost no Southern support. Many Southerners, upon seeing this, believed they no longer possessed meaningful political power. Therefore, South Carolina would secede from the Union. 10 more states would follow. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America and directly opposed the Union. Following secession, the Civil War began when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter. Both sides were expecting a quick victory. Instead, the war became America's bloodiest conflict. The First Battle of Bull Run demonstrated that the war would not be as easy as either side had believed. Similarly, the Battle of Antietam became the bloodiest single day in American history. Following Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The proclamation transformed slavery into the central issue of the war and discouraged European powers from helping the Confederacy, as they had already abolished slavery. Meanwhile, Lincoln passed the Homestead Act of 1862, encouraging Western settlement and attempting to ensure Western territories remained free from slavery. Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg turned the war in the North's favor. Gettysburg stopped Lee's invasion of the North, and Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy effectively in half. Lincoln would win re-election in 1864, and the Confederacy would officially surrender in 1865. Only 5 days later, Lincoln would be assassinated. Unfortunately for the North, Andrew Johnson became president. Before his death, Lincoln supported the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson took a lenient approach towards the South. Johnson attempted to veto the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but Congress overrode it. Congress also repeatedly overrode Johnson's vetoes of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, medical care, education, and assistance to former slaves and poor whites. It helped establish thousands of schools and laid the foundations for many black colleges. Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, dividing the South into 5 military districts. Union generals oversaw these districts and protected African American voting rights. Congress also passed the 14th Amendment, overturning Dred Scott and guaranteeing citizenship. The 15th Amendment followed, protecting voting rights regardless of race. Many Southern governments attempted to resist Reconstruction. Black codes, for instance, restricted African American freedoms. Vagrancy laws similarly criminalized unemployment and homelessness, allowing authorities to arrest African Americans for almost no reason and force them into labor. Many former slaves entered sharecropping arrangements, trapping themselves in cycles of debt. White supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and white leagues used violence and intimidation to suppress black political participation. In response, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, allowing federal troops to suppress these evil organizations. Amidst Reconstruction, westward expansion created increasing conflict with the Native Americans. The California Gold Rush, the Homestead Act, buffalo destruction, and repeated treaty violations all increased these tensions. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 became a major turning point. A U.S. cavalry force attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village carrying around 200 people, mostly women and children. Many Native Americans who previously sought peace towards Americans turned towards resistance. This contributed to Red Cloud's War and the Fetterman Massacre of 1866. The United States responded by signing the Treaty of Fort Laramie, recognizing the Great Sioux Reservation. However, gold discoveries soon led the government to violate this treaty. This sparked the Great Sioux War. Native Americans won a stunning victory at the Battle of Little Bighorn, defeating George Custer and his troops. Although the victory shocked Americans initially, the government would soon intensify military operations and force Native Americans onto stricter reservations. Following all of this conflict, the Compromise of 1877 would end Reconstruction and mark the end of Period 5. In exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes becoming the president, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. The South promised to respect African American civil rights. However, once those troops left, those promises were largely abandoned. Without federal protection, groups such as the KKK regained power. Reconstruction effectively ended as a failure. The end of Reconstruction directly led into the challenges of Period 6. For instance, the Dawes Act of 1877 attempted to assimilate Native Americans and continued the pattern of taking native land. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 symbolized the final destruction of native resistance. In the South, Jim Crow laws emerged because Reconstruction protections had disappeared. These developments culminated in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which established the doctrine of separate but equal. Just as the Missouri Compromise and Dred Scott had revealed America's divisions before the Civil War, Jim Crow and Plessy revealed how many of Reconstruction's promises had failed. Periods 4 and 5 are ultimately the story of a nation expanding across the continent while struggling to resolve the questions of slavery, citizenship, democracy, and equality.
Following the end of the Civil War, there was a boom in industrialization, westward expansion, and technological innovation that led to the Gilded Age. Throughout the Gilded Age, there were various social inequalities which filled gaps in wealth and economy, creating massive political corruption that defined this period. The Gilded Age consisted of big businesses and monopolies that dominated the economy with their corruption and control. It was also composed of figures like Carnegie and Rockefeller, who were both billionaires with a lot of power and control. One of the defining features of the Gilded Age was the massive boom in industrialization that occurred. Factories all across the country were mass producing and creating job opportunities that sparked tons of migration and immigration. There was also the expansion of railroads connecting the east and west of the U.S. As factories grew, millions of people migrated from rural areas to cities for work. This coincided with the surge of global immigration, with over 25 million immigrants arriving in the United States between 1870 and 1920. This rapid growth led to overcrowded, unsanitary tenement housing and squalid urban conditions. Because of the rapid industrialization occurring, dominant figures like Carnegie and Rockefeller dominated the economy and market. Andrew Carnegie was an industrialist and philanthropist who greatly expanded the steel industry, Carnegie Steel. Carnegie was known for his use of vertical integration, a business strategy where a company owns or controls multiple stages of its supply chain. Instead of relying on outside businesses, he bought every step of the supply chain, from the iron ore and coal mines to the railroads, ships, and steel mills, and as a result, he became one of the world's richest people. Rockefeller, however, used vertical integration to build his Standard Oil empire. He controlled every step of the supply chain, including oil, wells, pipelines, refineries, and distribution networks to cut costs, optimize operations, and eliminate middlemen. Industrialists utilized the theory of social Darwinism to justify vast wealth disparities, while Andrew Carnegie outlined the gospel of wealth, which argued the rich had a moral obligation to engage in philanthropy. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was a violent and pivotal labor dispute in Homestead, Pennsylvania, between the Carnegie Steel Company and the Amalgamated Association of the Iron and Steel Workers. Management slashed wages and locked workers out of the mill, culminating in a bloody battle between strikers and armed Pinkerton guards. On July 6, 1892, around 300 armed Pinkerton guards arrived by barge to take control of the plant and protect strikebreakers. Strikers and townspeople met with gunfire, dynamite, and cannons in a 12-hour battle that left at least 16 people dead. Following the violence, the governor sent in the Pennsylvania state militia to retake the town and protect replacement workers. Factories had harsh conditions on their workers. Most lived in poverty from the low wages, worked in unsafe conditions with long hours. The quality of life for a lot of these workers was terrible. However, as a result of the unsafe working conditions, the rise of labor unions like the AFL fought to help gain worker rights and to improve these conditions with safer work areas and better pay. There were also political movements like populist parties that formed from farmers to help combat the mass political corruption at this time. Following the construction of the railroad, settlements out west had increased. The railroad allowed for goods to be shipped west to east or east to west. Trading and business increased as a result, and it greatly accelerated westward expansion. However, the westward expansion had major conflicts with native populations. The railroad went through native land. Also, the buffalo were decimated, as many hunters slaughtered them. This would have devastating impacts on native populations, as they relied on the buffalo as a food source. Later, the Dawes Act would be passed. The Dawes Act was put into place to assimilate natives into American culture. Native families were split up and forced into boarding schools to learn to be more Western. As a result, the native cultures were damaged heavily, and languages and traditions became lost. The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," was used to help justify the forced assimilation and the harsh treatment endured by the natives. There were also violent native encounters between natives and the U.S. military. Some examples are the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre, for example, was a conflict in which the U.S. 7th Cavalry opened fire on an encampment of Lakota Sioux in South Dakota. This event resulted in the deaths of over 200 Native men, women, and children. The Battle of Little Bighorn was the most decisive Native American victory of the U.S. Army during the Plains War. George Custer and over 200 men of the 7th Cavalry were killed by a coalition of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho warriors. With Reconstruction ending, many African Americans, especially in the South, were left unprotected and fell victim to various racial inequalities like Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement. Jim Crow laws were what allowed segregation in the South, allowing racism to continue. African Americans were now stripped of their basic and civil rights as Americans as a result. The negative effects of racial inequalities like Jim Crow laws would leave a long-lasting impact. Disenfranchisement laws were specifically designed to strip African Americans of their voting rights through arbitrary measures, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and property requirements. Plessy v. Ferguson was a famous Supreme Court case that legalized segregation by upholding the doctrine of the separate but equal, providing legal justification for the Jim Crow laws. There were civil rights leaders that would fight to counter these unjust laws, such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington advocated for a gradual approach, urging African Americans to focus on vocational education, economic self-reliance, and business ownership rather than directly challenging segregation. He outlined this philosophy in his 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech. W.E.B. Du Bois opposed Washington's strategy, demanding immediate civil, political, and social inequality. He believed in the talented tenth of educated black Americans and helped found the Niagara Movement, which eventually led to the creation of the NAACP. Some other forms of racial inequality include the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which legally prohibited Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. The Gilded Age was marked with its rapid industrialization, with billionaires like Carnegie and Rockefeller. Westward expansion through the use of the Transcontinental Railroad, and political, social, and racial injustices like Jim Crow laws or the Dawes Act. As a result of the economic instability and corruption and the rapid industrialization, it led to the need for more social reform and change, thus leading up to Period 7.
Alright, let's dive into Period 7. Period 7 spans from 1890 to 1945. To put that into perspective, we're tracking America's transformation from an isolated post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction nation into a literal global superpower. We're going to start in 1890. So prior to this, the U.S. generally followed George Washington's address, which pretty much said that stay out of any foreign entanglements and focus specifically on what's going on in the U.S. Nothing in Europe. Don't focus on Europe. Don't focus on anything else. However, by 1890, it was declared that the American frontier was officially closed and that there was no more western wilderness to conquer, meaning that Manifest Destiny had pretty much completed and all of the Western Americas that the U.S. now spreads over was done. We conquered all of it. This led to thinkers like Alfred Thayer Mahan to write that if America wanted to compete with world powers, it needed a strong navy and overseas coaling stations. At the same time, cultural arguments like social Darwinism and the white man's burden were used to justify expanding American influence abroad, arguing that the U.S. had the duty to spread democracy and Christianity, similar to the travelers and conquistadors that came to the Americas hundreds of years before. This economic and cultural push boiled over in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. Cuba was trying to break free from Spain, and American newspapers utilized yellow journalism, sensationalized, exaggerated headlines to whip up public into a frenzy. When the U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, exploded in Havana Harbor, the media immediately blamed Spain. The rally cry became, "Remember the Maine, to hell with the Spain." The war was short, but its impact was massive. The U.S. won and signed the Treaty of Paris, acquiring a mini-empire, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while turning Cuba into a virtual protectorate through the Platt Amendment, which allowed the U.S. to intervene in Cuban affairs. This rapid expansion sparked a fierce national debate. The Anti-Imperialist League, featuring figures like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, argued that conquering other nations violated the core democratic values of the Declaration of Independence. Despite their protests, the U.S. pressed forward, fought a brutal guerrilla war to suppress a rebellion in the Philippines, and established the open-door policy in China to ensure American merchants had equal access to Chinese markets. Finally, Teddy Roosevelt added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, essentially declaring that the U.S. would act as an international police power in Latin America. While the U.S. was flexing its muscles abroad, things at home were a bit of a mess. The Gilded Age had left America with massive corporate monopolies, extreme poverty, corrupt political machines, and terrible working conditions. Enter the Progressive Era, which lasted roughly from 1900 to 1920. Progressivism wasn't a single unified movement. It was a loose coalition of reformers, journalists, and politicians who believed the government needed to take an active role in fixing society's problem. The frontline heroes of this era were the muckrakers, journalists who exposed corruption. You have Upton Sinclair, whose book The Jungle exposed the disgusting, unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry. You have Ida Tarbell, who exposed the ruthless monopolies of Rockefeller Standard Oil, and Jacob Riis, whose photography book How the Other Half Lives showed the horrific conditions of urban slums. Disasters also forced change. The Triangular Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 killed 146 young immigrant workers because emergency exits were locked, sparking national outrage and forcing states to pass strict workplace safety laws and worker compensation. Politically, progressives successfully amended the Constitution 4 times in a very short window. The 16th Amendment created a federal income tax. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators by citizens, bypassing corrupt state legislators. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, kicking off the era of Prohibition. And the 19th Amendment finally granted women the right to vote in 1920, thanks to decades of work by activists like Alice Paul and Susan B. Anthony. On the presidential level, Theodore Roosevelt championed his Square Deal, which focused on the 3 C's: control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Teddy Roosevelt became known as a trust buster, distinguishing between good trusts that served the public and bad trusts that abused power. This progressive momentum continued through the presidencies of William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson, who created the Federal Reserve System to stabilize the nation's economy. Moving on, in 1914, Europe erupted into World War I. President Woodrow Wilson immediately declared American neutrality. He even won re-election in 1916 on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But neutrality didn't last. Germany began practicing unrestricted submarine warfare, using submarines to sink any ship aiding the Allies. The sinking of the British ocean liner Lusitania in 1915 killed over 100 Americans in strained relations. The final straw came in 1917 with the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message intercepted by the British in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico, promising to help Mexico reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if the U.S. entered the war. Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, framing it as a moral crusade to make the world safe for democracy. The U.S. entry in 1917 tipped the balance of power to the Allies, but the home front underwent a radical transformation to make total war possible. The government created the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, to flood the nation with pro-war propaganda. To suppress dissent, Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, making it illegal to criticize the government or the war effort. This was famously challenged in Supreme Court case Schneck v. United States, where the court ruled that freedom of speech could be restricted if it presented a clear and present danger to the country. The war economy also triggered the Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans left the Jim Crow South for the northern and western industrial cities to escape racial violence and fill the manufacturing jobs left by vacant soldiers. When the war ended in 1918, Wilson traveled to Europe with his 14 points, a blueprint for peaceful post-war world. His favorite point was the creation of the League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future global conflicts. However, back home, the U.S. Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, strongly opposed it. Reservationists in the Senate feared that joining the League would drag America into endless foreign conflicts without congressional approval. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, and the U.S. never joined the League of Nations, retreating back to isolationism. With the war over, America entered the 1920s, a decade defined by a massive cultural tug-of-war between traditional rural values and modern urban lifestyles. The decade began with a backlash against radical ideas known as the First Red Scare. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Americans became terrified of a communist takeover. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer conducted the Palmer Raids, arresting and deporting thousands of suspected radicals and immigrants without due process. This fear fueled intense nativism, leading Congress to pass the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924, which placed strict limits on immigration, specifically targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans. The cultural clash was put on full display during the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. A Tennessee biology teacher, John Scopes, was arrested for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, which violated a state law banning anything that contradicted the Bible. The trial became a media circus, symbolizing the battle between religious fundamentalism and modern scientific thought. Meanwhile, the urban economy was booming. Thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line, automobiles became affordable for the average family, transforming American infrastructure and social life. The rise of consumer goods like radios and vacuum cleaners, combined with the new practice of buying on credit or installment plans, created a massive consumer culture. Women's roles changed too, at least symbolically. Flappers challenged traditional gender norms by wearing shorter skirts, cutting their hair into bobs, smoking and drinking in illegal speakeasies during Prohibition. In northern cities, African American culture flourished in what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. This was a massive explosion of black literature, art, and music. Writers like Langston Hughes and musicians like Louis Armstrong captured both the hardships and the pride of African American experience, cementing jazz as a definitive soundtrack of the decade. Unfortunately, the party of the 1920s came to a crashing halt in October 1929. The stock market crashed on Black Tuesday, exposing the deep structural weakness of the decade's economy, such as widespread overproduction, wealth inequality, and risky stock speculation through buying on margin. The economy collapsed into the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment skyrocketed to 25%. To make matters worse, severe droughts and poor farming practices created the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains, destroying farms and forcing thousands of displaced farmers to migrate to California. President Herbert Hoover believed in rugged individualism, the idea that the federal government shouldn't give direct financial relief to citizens because it would destroy their work ethic. He thought local charities and voluntary business corporations would fix the economy. This approach failed to meet the scale of the crisis. Desperate people living in shanty towns sarcastically named them Hoovervilles. The lowest point of his presidency came when he ordered the military to forcefully clear out the bonus army, a group of impoverished World War I veterans who had marched on Washington to demand their military bonuses early. In 1932, Americans overwhelmingly elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised a new deal for the American people. FDR fundamentally transformed the role of the federal government. He used his radio broadcast, fireside chats, to speak directly to the public and restore trust in the banking system. The New Deal focused on the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. FDR passed a flurry of legislation creating alphabet agencies. First, the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. This gave jobs to young men doing environmental projects. Next, the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This paid farmers subsidies to limit production and raise crop prices. The SEC, or the Securities and Exchange Commission, was created to regulate the stock market and prevent another crash. The FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, ensured bank deposits so people wouldn't lose their savings if a bank failed. Finally, the Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for the elderly, disabled, and unemployed, which is still a massive part of the government spending today. The New Deal faced heavy criticism. Left-wing critics like Huey Long argued it didn't go far enough to redistribute wealth, while conservative critics in the Supreme Court argued it was an unconstitutional overreach of federal power. In response, FDR tried to pass the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, better known as the Court Packing Plan, to add 6 pro-New Deal justices to the Supreme Court. This plan was widely condemned as a dangerous power grab and failed, marking a rare political defeat for FDR. While the New Deal saved millions from starvation and reforming the banking system, it did not actually end the Great Depression. What actually ended the Great Depression was World War II. As totalitarian dictators rose to power in Europe and Asia during the 1930s, the U.S. clung tightly to isolationism, passing a series of neutrality acts designed to keep America out of foreign conflicts. But, as Nazi Germany overran Europe, FDR slowly nudged the country towards supporting the Allies. First came the cash and carry policy, and eventually the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which allowed the U.S. to send military supplies to Great Britain, effectively turning America into the arsenal of democracy. The debate over isolationism ended instantly on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. FDR called it a date which will live in infamy, and the U.S. officially entered World War II. The home front mobilized on an unprecedented scale. Factories shifted from making cards and consumer goods to producing tanks, planes, and ammunition. This massive industrial output completely eliminated unemployment and finally dragged the U.S. economy out of the Great Depression. Women entered the defense industries in massive numbers, symbolized by the propaganda icon Rosie the Riveter. African Americans fought in segregated units abroad and pushed for the Double V campaign at home. Victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. However, the war also led to severe civil liberty violations. Fear and wartime hysteria led FDR to sign Executive Order 9066, which ordered the forced relocation and internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, the majority of whom were U.S. citizens. The Supreme Court upheld this action in the landmark case Korematsu v. United States, ruling that civil liberties could be suspended during a time of military necessity. In terms of military strategy, the U.S. fought a two-front war. In Europe, the turning point came on June 6, 1944, with the D-Day invasion of Normandy, leading to the eventual liberation of Europe and the fall of Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, American forces utilized a strategy called island hopping, capturing strategic islands one by one to get close enough to launch a direct invasion of Japan. Instead of a land invasion, the war came to a dramatic conclusion through a top-secret Manhattan Project, which developed the world's first atomic weapons. In August 1945, President Harry Truman ordered the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly after. As Period 7 closes in 1945, the global landscape has changed entirely. Europe lays in ruins, the old colonial empires were collapsing, and the United States stood as the undisputed economic and military superpower of the world, equipped with nuclear weapons and prepared to enter a brand new global conflict, the Cold War.
We're going to walk through some of the most important events in U.S. history from 1945 to the present, using Minecraft builds to help tell the story. We'll start with Period 8, right after World War II, and move all the way to Period 9, our modern era. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became rival superpowers. They entered an intense, long-lasting conflict called the Cold War, starting in 1947. There was no direct large-scale fighting between the two. Instead, they fought through proxy wars, like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and through politics, technology, and military buildup. The U.S. strategy was called containment, which focused on stopping the spread of communism. One early step in containment was the Truman Doctrine in 1947. President Harry S. Truman announced that the U.S. would give political, military, and economic aid to democratic nations threatened by communism. The U.S. sent $400 million in aid to Greece. This ended America's older policy of isolationism and helped make the U.S. a global superpower. The Truman Doctrine successfully contained Soviet expansion and set the stage for the Marshall Plan. In 1948, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid program to rebuild Western Europe after World War II. About $13 billion, which is now around $137 billion in today's money, to 17 European countries to modernize industry, remove trade barriers, and help their democracies stay strong. This not only rebuilt war-torn nations, but also contained the spread of communism, making these countries more stable. As tensions grew, the U.S. and the Soviet Union entered an arms race. Both sides built up more and more powerful weapons to try and gain a strategic advantage. This led to the development and mass production of nuclear bombs, raising the risk of total destruction. Later, both sides tried to limit this buildup. These two included SALT I and SALT II. SALT I was an agreement that limited certain nuclear weapons, and it marked the high point of détente, a temporary easing of tensions. SALT II tried to limit arms again, but it failed when the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. In the long run, the U.S. is often seen as having won the arms race, partly because the Soviet Union economy couldn't keep up. The rivalry moved into space in the space race, starting around 1955. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first man-made object in space. In 1961, they sent Yuri Gagarin on Vostok 1, making him the first human to fly in space and orbit the Earth. The U.S. responded with the Apollo program. In 1969, Apollo 11 launched the first humans on the moon: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Even though the Soviet Union were the first into space, landing on the moon meant the U.S. effectively won the space race. Cold War fear spread inside the U.S. too. From 1947 to 1954, the country went through the Second Red Scare, a period of intense fear of communist subversion and spying. Key triggers to the Second Red Scare were China's fall to communism, the Soviet Union's first atomic bomb testing, which made Americans fear they were losing the Cold War, and real Soviet cases of spies, which made the threat feel real. One example was when Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed he had a list of communists in the State Department, gaining national attention. This also fueled nationwide fears of communist subversion. Another example is in Hollywood, the Hollywood 10, which included writers, directors, and producers, all refused to testify about alleged Communist Party ties. In 1947, they were cited for contempt of Congress and were ostracized from the entertainment industry. The Second Red Scare showed how fear of communism could lead to violations of civil liberties. Cold War tensions nearly exploded into direct war multiple times. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba. The U.S. trained about 1,500 Cuban exiles and supported their invasion, but within 3 days they were crushed by Cuban forces. More than 1,100 exiles were captured. In 1962, the U.S. secured their release in exchange for $52 million in food and medicine. The failure embarrassed the Kennedy administration and pushed Castro to seek closer ties with the Soviet Union. This helped lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. For 13 days, the U.S. and the Soviet Union faced off in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when the Cold War came closest to full-scale nuclear war. The crisis ended in a compromise. The compromise was the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. The U.S. publicly promised never to invade Cuba, and they secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This deal avoided a nuclear disaster. The Cold War also turned into proxy wars. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was the first major one. Communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded capitalist South Korea, backed by the U.S. and the UN. The war ended in a stalemate, with the Korean Armistice Agreement creating the 38th parallel as a divided line. About 5 million people died. Firebombing was one of the most destructive and catastrophic techniques used, which killed many troops and civilians. The Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975 was another major proxy war. Communist North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, fought a capitalist South Vietnam backed by the United States. Again, the U.S. was trying to contain communism, but after years of brutal fighting, including firebombing that killed many soldiers and civilians, North Vietnam won, and Vietnam became fully communist. While wars raged abroad, American culture was changing at home. In the 1960s and 1970s, the hippie movement became a major counterculture. Hippies rejected mainstream materialism and conformity, and strongly opposed the Vietnam War. They promoted peace, love, personal freedom, and communal living. Many used recreational drugs like marijuana and LSD in an attempt to expand consciousness. At the same time, the government tried to improve life for many Americans. From 1964 to 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson launched the Great Society. Its goals were to eliminate poverty and end racial injustice. It was the largest expansion of social welfare since the New Deal. Some of these key programs included Medicare, which provided health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, which provided health insurance for low-income individuals, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which attacked segregation and racial discrimination in voting. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was another example, which reformed immigration laws. Instead of just building new suburbs, the Great Society focused on fixing existing communities with civil rights protections, housing acts, and desegregation of neighborhoods. The civil rights movement was one of the most important struggles of this era. In 1954, the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education was held, in which the court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson, which had allowed separate but equal segregation. Brown helped spark the modern civil rights movement. A bus boycott took place in Montgomery, Alabama. It began when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated bus. For 13 months, African Americans refused to ride city buses, challenging segregation. The boycott succeeded, leading to a Supreme Court ruling that segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional, and it helped make Martin Luther King Jr. a national civil rights leader. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine, which was 9 African American students, helped desegregate Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. They faced violent protest as they tried to attend school. President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent the National Guard to protect them and enforce desegregation through Executive Order 10730. In response, Arkansas Governor Orval Faubus closed all 4 public schools in Little Rock for a year to resist integration. In 1963, the March on Washington became one of the largest peaceful political demonstrations in U.S. history. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Roy Wilkins, and Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a massive crowd. Here, King delivered his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," calling for protections against job and voter discrimination and for integrated public schools. The march was a major success. One of the biggest victories was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law officially outlawed systematic racism, ending Jim Crow laws, and bans discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson and marked a huge triumph for the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement also included efforts to improve workers' rights. In 1965, Filipino farm workers in the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC, went on strike against Delano grape growers to protest low wages and poor working conditions. AWOC later joined with the United Farm Workers Association, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Together, they formed the United Farm Workers and organized a nationwide grape boycott. The movement helped improve conditions for farm workers and became an important part of the broader fight for civil rights and labor rights. From 1972 to 1974, the Watergate scandal rocked President Richard Nixon's administration. It started when burglars with ties to Nixon and the White House broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. They were caught trying to bug phones and steal documents. Instead of distancing himself, Nixon and his team tried to cover it up. Investigators later discovered that Nixon had secretly recorded all conversations in the Oval Office. The tapes revealed his involvement. Facing impeachment and removal, Nixon chose to resign, becoming the first and only president to resign from office. In 1973, the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution's implied rights of privacy protected a pregnant woman's liberties to choose to have an abortion. After about 50 years, Roe was overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which said the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion and returned the issue to the states. That later change is beyond our main time period, but it also shows how long-lasting Roe's impact was. Moving into Period 9, new threats emerged. On September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes in a coordinated attack on the U.S. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 hit the Pentagon. 1 crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. In total, 2,977 people were killed. The attackers were linked to the extremist group Al-Qaeda. The attacks caused shock, grief, and then a wave of nationalism, especially after President George W. Bush's speech known as the Steel of American Resolve. These events sparked the War of Terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, and major changes in security and anti-terror laws. U.S. actions in the Middle East and beyond also shaped this period. During the 1980s, the U.S. secretly provided weapons to both Iran and Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. This led to the Iran-Contra affair, a major political scandal. Under the Reagan administration, the U.S. illegally sold arms to Iran, trying to free American hostages. It then covertly sent the money to support Contra rebels in Nicaragua, directly violating congressional bans. Later, in 2003, the U.S. and the U.K. invaded Iraq, claiming it had weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda. The Iraqi regime collapsed in weeks, but no weapons of mass destruction were found. The U.S. government stepped in. Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, using $700 billion in taxpayer money to buy failing assets and rescue the banking industry. Also, under President Barack Obama, the government passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, pouring $787 billion into the economy through tax cuts, infrastructure projects, and unemployment benefits to create jobs. Unemployment peaked at 10% in October 2009. In response, the U.S. passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act to increase government oversight of the financial sector and help prevent another crisis. From the Cold War and the proxy wars to the civil rights movement, political scandals, terrorist attacks, and the Great Recession, the U.S. has faced constant challenges from 1945 to today. Each event changed American society and the country's role in the world. Hopefully, the Minecraft world helped you see how these events connect. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Minecraft history videos.